That sounds crazy, right? It sounds a bit like what I'm saying is, what if everybody everywhere was totally full of shit always? But just think about it. What if everybody everywhere was totally full of shit always? Yeah. Well, that's the first stop on our journey today. In the 1960s, in Caltech, Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry conducted a series of experiments known as the split brain study. Basically, there was a group of patients with intractable epilepsy. There were very few options available to help these patients, and their symptoms were incredibly serious. There's an area of the brain called the corpus callosum, and its job is to connect the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere so that information can flow freely between the two sides of the brain. In order to help these patients, surgeons severed the corpus callosum, disconnecting the two hemispheres, essentially separating one brain into two. Kind of like how a firefighter would dig a fire break in a forest to stop the fire spreading. Similarly, in the brain, they wanted to create this gap, this disconnection, to stop out of control electrical activity from cascading all around the brain. The operation was a huge success. It reduced their symptoms massively, 60 to 70% in some cases, and others were now totally free of seizures. Even more strangely, the loved ones of these patients reported that for such a major intervention, they hadn't noticed any major cognitive impairments or differences in these patients. No split personality, no split consciousness. They were expecting some serious repercussions, obviously, but they didn't seem to see them. Now, this offered up a huge opportunity for Sperry and Gazzaniga to make use of this unusual set of subjects, because sometimes when we break things, we have a real chance to finally understand more about how they actually work. Before we go any further, we just need to understand a little bit about the wiring of the normal human brain. It's a little complicated to describe just on audio, so work with me a little. It might take some visualization. Okay, so the left brain hemisphere takes in information from the sensory organs of the right-hand side of the body, and it also sends information to those sensory organs on the right-hand side of the body. So left brain, right ear, for example. So it's kind of cross-wired. And then the reverse is true on the other side. The right brain hemisphere takes in information from the sensory organs of the left-hand side of the body, and it sends information to those left-hand side of the body sensory organs as well. So right brain, left ear. Left brain, right ear. Right brain, left ear. That okay? The reason for these signals crossing over in this way isn't really known, but it is this way for all vertebrates. Also, certain hemispheres have specific modules or areas of specialization that seem to specialize in certain functions. So, in most people, the left hemisphere specializes in reading and speech, and the right hemisphere has only very basic language capabilities. But it can independently communicate through gesture by controlling the left hand. Remember, right brain, left bodily control. And any gestures made with the left hand. So it can control any gestures made with the left hand. Super weird, but apparently true. At this point, I've said the words left and right so much, I wouldn't blame you if you were humming the hokey cokey and freaking out. Look, I hope that passes. So, Gazzaniga and Sperry looked to set up a lot of different experiments in which they sent information to only one half of the brain. If I show something to my left visual field, I know that the information is going to reach the right hemisphere of my brain. And I also know, if I'm a split brain patient, I know that my corpus callosum has been severed. So once the information is in the right hemisphere of my brain, that information cannot reach the left hemisphere of my brain, because the route to reach the left brain from the right has been cut. So if I get information in that route visually shown to the right hemisphere only, and then someone asks me a verbal question and I'm expected to respond verbally, my left hemisphere, which you'll recall is responsible for speech, it doesn't actually have access to that information. It doesn't have any pertinent facts to work with. So what would happen? I know, right? What a bananas experiment to be able to run on a human. But they did it. They asked a subject to stand up by showing him a sign to his left visual field, sending the information to his right hemisphere, saying literally, get up and leave the room. That's what the sign said. And when he saw this, he dutifully stood up and started to leave the room. And when he did so, they verbally asked him why he was getting up and where he was going. So his left hemisphere would be responsible for giving that answer verbally. but it didn't have access to any information about the actual trigger for the action, the sign shown to the right hemisphere. And so when asked, he said, I needed a drink. I'm just going to get a Coke. Which the experimenters knew was obviously a total fabrication, a lie that was just about believable if you didn't know the real trigger for him standing up. But he did answer in this kind of emotionally congruent way. It didn't seem like a conscious fabrication. And the subject himself seemed to believe it to be true. It was automatic. But it was no more connected to reality than Kanye West is right now. This dates the podcast, but Kanye, you gotta let Kim go. Come on, man. Relax. She's with Pete now. This is something that they saw over and over again in a series of multiple different experiments. They saw this kind of left narrating brain just coming up with seat-of-the-pants justifications for why certain answers were given, though the experimenters knew for a fact that that particular part of the brain had no access to a real answer grounded in any kind of actual fact. Yeah, you could say that left brain was Bill Clinton when he did not have sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. It was just flat out lying. I want you to think about that for a moment, about the implications of that. I'll wait. Listen real close. Can you hear that faint, whispering voice? You're totally full of shit all the time. Another crazy fact that they demonstrated is that sometimes you might not even have conscious access to the underlying process that's really driving your response or emotional state. To demonstrate this, they asked a young teenage patient out loud the first part of a question. Who was your favourite? So both hemispheres could hear the start of that question, but not the subject of the question, which was going to come. They then lateralized the information about the subject to the right hemisphere by showing the boy's left visual field the word girlfriend. At which point he immediately smiled and blushed and acted embarrassed, demonstrating a clear mood shift. Then verbally he said that he didn't hear the end of the sentence because he didn't. And after that, he wouldn't say anything more. So in the moment when shown the triggering word, he had exactly the right emotional response for a teenage boy being asked about a girl. But he couldn't articulate why he had acted that way. Eventually, when pressed, he was able to spell out his girlfriend's name with his left hand. So that's congruent with everything else. The right hemisphere non-verbally gave the answer with the information that it had. If you saw that in a horror movie, you'd be waiting for the boy's head to spin 360 degrees. In the first example, what Gazzaniga called the interpreter module, this narrator of the brain, kind of just came up with a good enough rationalization for why something happened. I'm just going to go get a Coke. Well, interestingly, that actually seems to be part of the brain's job, how it's meant to work. Of course, most people are not split-brained, and so for you and me, information flows freely between both hemispheres. But what these experiments suggested was that the mind was not simply one thing, but rather a group of things, modules, one of which seemed to have the job very specifically of creating a coherent narrative to explain the actions that have already been independently decided by other modules in the brain ahead of time. Gazzaniga explains the job of this module is to seek causes for events. But he calls out that because the interpreter exists separate to the modules that are the true causes of our emotions, it needs to quickly land on something, some reasoning for what's going on. So for this narrator of our story, the first makes sense explanation will do. Isn't that insane? Totally full of shit. I like how Samuel Beckett put it in his play, Waiting for Godot. Estragon says, "We always find something, eh, Diddy, to give us the impression we exist." And Vladimir says, yes, we're magicians.